Jason and I were discussing some time back about the sermon that, as senior warden, I'm apparently contractually obligated to give. We talked and we agreed on this week. Jason, however, failed to mention to me at the time that this Sunday is traditionally called Low Sunday. So not knowing what that means, I, of course, did what I always do, went on the internet, did some research, and found lots of reasons why it's called Low Sunday. One of those explanations I found is that the name is a reference to the quality of sermon that's typically delivered by the week after Easter, because the preacher has used all of their best material on Easter Sunday for the full house. So I'm here to tell you that that explanation is just an old wives' tale. But if you do find the quality of sermon lacking today, I guess you only have the old wives to blame. Or Jason. So, show of hands, who here likes old movies? There you go. It's like rainbows and puppy dogs. Who doesn't like old movies? I love old movies. I love turning on TNT or Turner Classic Movies and seeing one of those old chestnuts and just buckling it and saying, this is going to be great. Because you know how they go. You know how the story goes every year, but you still love watching it. But if you're anything like me, I love rewatching those old movies, but then finding myself in one of those movies where it takes sort of a dark or an unfortunate turn or something bad happens to one of the main characters, I find myself kind of hoping that maybe this time, maybe by some miracle this time, the story's going to change. Maybe we'll see a different outcome. So, for instance, watching Titanic, maybe this is the time that ship captain's going to see that big iceberg and he's going to say, let's just turn that ship, get everyone to New York safe and sound, and we'll go and have a nice dinner at Delmonico's. Or in It's a Wonderful Life, when Uncle Billy's in the bank branch and he leaves that envelope of money on the table, and mean Mr. Potter finds it and takes it, and then the bad stuff starts happening to our friend George Bailey. And I find myself like, Uncle Billy, turn around, go back, get the money. Maybe this time he'll walk out with it and everything will be fine. Nope, never happens. And so it is with the Bible stories that we hear every year. These great old stories that we hear, and we look forward to it, and we know they're gonna come up. Like 2 weeks ago, we heard the story of St. Peter, our friend Peter, to whom Jesus said, before the cock crows twice in the morning, you'll betray me 3 times. I find myself hearing that and saying, Pete, my man, you're the rock. Jesus called you the rock. The rock doesn't bow down in front of other people. He doesn't cower. He gets and says, no, Jesus is my friend. I am his friend. Nope. Every year, Peter, he denies him, just like Jesus says. And so it is today. So it is this morning. The story that we hear every year this week, the story of another of Jesus' disciples, this time St. Thomas, or as history and we have come to call him, Doubting Thomas, right? So the story is a familiar one. We've all heard it many times, maybe dozens of times. And yes, we're going to hear it again. So on Easter Day, the disciples, they're hiding. They're locked in a room. They're cowering in fear. And suddenly, Jesus appears to them. And of course, these disciples, they're elated. They're rejuvenated. This is a miracle. Except one of the disciples, well, 2 of the disciples aren't with them. Judas, for obvious reasons, and Thomas. Thomas is not there. Thomas is not in the room with the other disciples. So the disciples run out. They find Thomas, and they said, Thomas, we have seen the Lord. And here's the part of the story where my internal color commentary says, come on, Thomas, believe your friends. Something wonderful has happened, something miraculous, something that will literally change the course of humanity. At this point, all I need is for Thomas to say, great. But nope, we don't hear that. Every year, the story goes down the familiar path. And what does Thomas say? Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, put my fingers where the nails were, and until I put my hands into his side, I will not believe it. That's what he says, or at least the Aramaic version of that. And for that, because he didn't take their word for it, because he wanted proof, because he wanted to see it for his own eyes. He has for 2,000 years been called Doubting Thomas. So I suppose there are worse things you can be called than doubting. I know I've been called worse things than doubting. But certainly that doesn't put Thomas in a very encouraging light, does it? It makes him sound like a pessimist, like a downer, like a party pooper. But more importantly, it sounds like Thomas is denying the possibility that his master has returned and that he's been resurrected. And given what a momentous event it was, you don't want to be remembered as the first person to say, it didn't happen. But was his doubt understandable? Is it something that anybody else, any of us, might have shared at the same time? Let's look a little more closely at what was going on at the time and what had happened just before that. Think about Thomas. He'd just lost his master, his inspiration, the man for whom he'd literally given up everything to follow. And then he was gone, and all hope was gone. The future for Thomas was literally black. So, for whatever reason, Thomas wasn't in the room with the other 10 disciples that day when Jesus first appeared. So, we'll never know. The record doesn't show what he was actually doing at that point. Was he off in mourning? Was he, like the other disciples, cowering in fear in his own place? Was he in quiet reflection? We don't know. But for whatever reason, we know that he missed the main event that day, that Easter day. Here's a time for a little side editorial. This is a really good lesson about what happens when you skip church and you miss the events. Sometimes really cool stuff happens, so you want to be there, right? Okay, back to our story. But Thomas, he didn't get to see what everyone else saw. He didn't get to experience what they experienced. The other disciples, they didn't have to have faith. Why? Because they got to see it for themselves. They got this miracle for themselves. So when the disciples, when they ran out, when they found Thomas, when they said, "You'll never believe what happened," his response was, "You're right. I don't believe." And can we blame him? I mean, first off, we know the disciples. We've heard all the stories from the Gospels. They're not necessarily known for their astute observations and their well-thought-out decisions all the time, are they? Thomas may have just had a healthy skepticism that what he heard from his well-meaning but sometimes misguided friends may have been a little off that day. Or maybe he was just terrified of what it could mean to have Jesus risen. Or maybe he just couldn't wrap his head around all of this. But even more, it may have been that believing was just more than he could handle that day. After all, Thomas had just lost everything. He'd lost everything. He was in blackness, and now he's being asked to open up to the possibility of hope, to risk this hope, and to risk it not being true, to risk it not being a true story, and then having to experience that loss all over again. For any of us who's ever experienced the loss of a loved one, would anyone be blamed for not wanting to go through that pain a second time? So there was Thomas, the odd disciple out, the one who hadn't seen for himself and was being asked, just believe. And he simply wasn't ready to do that. Not yet anyway. So then, 8 days later, Thomas had his chance too. This time, they were all gathered, the 11 disciples, the doors were locked again, and Jesus once again appears. And then, that memorable scene where Jesus says to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand. Put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." No, Thomas doesn't have to believe anymore because he's seen it for himself. He knows Jesus has been resurrected because he can see it. And he responds by saying, "My Lord and my God." This, I believe, is the first time in the Bible that any of the disciples, has ever called Jesus God. And for the first time, They understand that Jesus is not just a teacher. He's not just a prophet or a rabbi or a healer. He's God incarnate, and he was sent to the world to save us. And it was Thomas who recognized that and saw it first. And for that, he gets to spend millennia being best remembered for his skepticism. I think it's time we give our man Thomas a new nickname, but that's another day. So the story concludes with Jesus telling Thomas and the assembled disciples, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." And of course, he's talking about us. And what he's talking about is the foundation of what all of us are asked to do in all of our lives: to believe, to have faith. What is faith? One definition among many that I like is trust or confidence in the absence of proof. Trust or confidence in the absence of proof. In the absence of physical proof, we're asked to make a commitment, to take a stand, to change our lives. That's a tall order. Because no definition of faith that I found says that we get to enjoy this trust or this confidence in the absence of doubt. And that's the hard part, isn't it? Who among us hasn't experienced some pang of doubt, some little nugget of questioning, a crisis of confidence at some point along the way? And who hasn't thought at some point, you know, God, if you just showed yourself, if you just gave me one of those signs, one of those burning bush thingies, you know, this faith thing would be a whole lot easier. So I'm not going to ask for a show of hands of who's felt that before. I'll trust that some of you have. But having that faith, that belief in the absence of proof, that's really what all of us are asked to do. And as Jesus himself said, we're blessed for doing so. At the same time, just because God doesn't stand in front of us in embodied form, just because he doesn't erect a neon sign in our front yard saying, "I am here," doesn't mean that he himself to us in many different ways. Some small, some large, some tiny. Who's watched the sunrise over the ocean or experienced the stillness standing alone in the woods without feeling his presence? Many of us have had our own prayers answered in often miraculous ways. Or many of us know his love in the smile of a newborn child or in receiving assistance from a complete stranger in a time of need. The more we seek, the more we open ourselves up, our hearts open to the possibility of knowing, the more our faith can be strengthened by these little nuggets of revelation. And faith, belief, it's not something that is binary. You either have it or you don't. It's not something that once you get it, you never lose it. It's like a muscle or a skill. It's something that you have to spend your whole life building, maintaining, and strengthening. So this continued seeking, this questioning, this looking for answers that we may never get, that's what keeps us moving forward and draws us ever closer. Closer to God, closer to our loved ones,